Today we're cracking open another chapter in the Urban Bible. Highways. When you drive through a city, the highway feels like a natural feature of the landscape, just a line on your GPS, a blur of concrete and signs. But cities aren't born with highways, they are carved open by them. This is the South Bronx, one of the poorest urban neighborhoods in America, and a lot of what you're looking at came down to one man, one highway, and the decision to drive straight through a living neighborhood because it was easier than going around it. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the mid-20th century when the automobile was the symbol of everything. Progress, freedom, the future, paved in concrete. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, the largest public works program in American history at the time. The official goals were three things: Cold War military logistics, interstate commerce, and faster suburban commutes. What wasn't in the brochure was, to build these highways through cities, you had to route them somewhere, and somewhere followed a very consistent pattern. Planners carved corridors for people who lived outside the city, entirely at the expense of those who lived within it. Infrastructure is never neutral, and the concrete didn't just connect destinations. It decided which neighborhoods mattered, and which one could be sacrificed. Meet Robert Moses, never elected to a single public office, but through a web of appointed authorities and commissions, he accumulated more real power over the physical shape of New York City than any mayor in its history. He built the highways, the bridges, the tunnels, and the parks, and he had a philosophy about what got in the way. He once compared his process to making an omelet. You break some eggs, he meant neighborhoods, he meant people. In 1948, Moses proposed the Cross Bronx Expressway, and he routed it directly through East Tremont, which at the time was one of the most racially integrated neighborhoods in the entire country. Jewish immigrants, Irish, Italian, Black, Puerto Rican, a working community that had built itself. There was an alternative route, 1 block south. It would have displaced far fewer people and avoided the densest residential blocks entirely. The local community found it, mapped it, then presented it. Moses rejected it. His engineers called it technically complicated. Historians have spent decades concluding that Moses knew exactly what he was doing. Around 60,000 people were displaced during the project's construction from 1948 to 1972. Property values collapsed. White residents who could leave did, helped by government-backed mortgages. Thanks to redlining, their Black and Latino neighbors stayed trapped. Services dried up. Landlords, realizing they could collect more from insurance than from tenants, began torching their own buildings. Around 80% of housing stock in parts of the South Bronx was destroyed. Around 250,000 people were displaced, this time by fire. A single highway didn't just cut through a neighborhood. It created conditions where neighborhoods couldn't survive at all. 1,000 miles south, the same story played out. Miami's Overtown neighborhood was known as the Harlem of the South, and it earned that name. 2nd Avenue, or Little Broadway, was lined with hundreds of Black-owned businesses. Ella Fitzgerald played there, Nat King Cole, Count Basie. The biggest Black performers in America played Overtown because the segregated hotels of Miami Beach wouldn't let them stay. In the 1960s, I-95 was routed deliberately through it. The highway and its massive interchange demolished over 40 blocks, the main commercial strips, the residential core, the businesses, the social fabric. Around 12,000 residents were directly displaced, and because those residents had almost nowhere else they were legally permitted to live under Jim Crow, many ended up in peripheral neighborhoods even further from economic opportunity. Overtown's population had been close to 50,000 at its peak. After the highway, it collapsed to around 10,000. The neighborhood had never recovered. And here's a detail that should make you pause the video down for a second. Planners knew. Internal documents from the period show Overtown was seen as a land grab opportunity. One estimate at the time put the number of people who would need to be displaced at 5,684. The real figure ended up being more than double. Nobody corrected it. Nobody tried. Now, let's go to Seoul, South Korea, because in 2003, Seoul looked at a 6-lane elevated expressway carrying 168,000 vehicles a day and decided to tear it out. Under the highway was a river, an actual historical stream, the Cheonggyecheon, buried under concrete since the 1950s, then built over with an elevated highway in the 1970s. The city spent $281 million, worked for 27 months, and restored 3.6 miles of stream through the city center as a public linear park. Traffic engineers predicted gridlock. Business owners along the corridor threatened to sue. Street vendors who'd build livelihoods selling to stuck drivers threatened to shut the whole thing down. What actually happened was land values in the surrounding area shot up 25 to 50%. The local temperature dropped by more than 3 degrees. Biodiversity in the area increased by 639%, and the traffic apocalypse everyone predicted, it didn't come. Instead, something urban planners called traffic evaporation kicked in. Drivers shifted to transit, changed routes, rethought their commutes. Remove a road and people adapt. The city became easier to move through, not harder. Slowly, after decades of evidence from around the world, the U.S. is catching up. In 2021, the federal government created the Reconnecting Communities pilot program, which provided $1 billion in federal funding to cap, remove, or redesign highways that have historically isolated neighborhoods. Cities lined up. In Detroit, plans are underway to remove the I-375 freeway entirely and replace it with a street-level boulevard, reconnecting the historic Black Bottom district to downtown for the first time since the highway cut it off decades ago. In Atlanta, a project called The Stitch plans to build a 14-acre park platform directly over the I-75/85 downtown connector, the highway that fractured Atlanta's core neighborhoods from each other, a green bridge stitched over a cannon of traffic. And in Rochester, they've already done it, converted 2/3 of a mile of the Inner Loop Expressway into a regular city street, $23.6 million invested, $229 million in economic development that followed. 50% more people are walking. New housing on the reclaimed land. For the first time in generations, the question isn't where do we build the next highway, it's which ones are we taking down. The highway feels like a natural feature of the landscape, but it wasn't. A single line on a blueprint decided who got displaced and who got connected, which neighborhood got sacrificed, and which suburb got its commute. Those lines were drawn by specific people with specific interests, who rejected certain alternatives on purpose. The highway was always a choice. So is tearing it down.